corners on the pages. And I often get asked, Andrew, like, okay, why are we talking with somebody like Disney? And the reason for that is what you're going to talk about with our audience today is not something that only Disney can do, and it doesn't require a Disney-sized budget, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The natural question is, of course, why do we look at Disney? We're not in the same industry as them, but there's so many commonalities if you just boil it down to the essence of running a business. They have all the same challenges that any other business does, and their aspirations are like any other business. So just on a very fundamental level, because they have a combination of, which is very rare actually, of being not only one of the most admired companies in the world, but also one of the most profitable. Rarely do those two things actually go together, but they do with Disney. They're one of a handful of companies where that applies. So they absolutely are a great example of someone who we should be learning from.
Absolutely. And so you're not just like one or two park visits. You're a man who has been around the world. Tell us a little bit about how your fascination and now career of studying Disney came to be.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. When I was growing up in England, as you can tell from the accent, as a young, excuse me, schoolboy, I was waiting in a doctor's waiting room one day, and I happened to pick up a Reader's Digest book, which some younger viewers may not know what that is, but certainly most of us do. And there was an article in there about Walt and his journey and life story. And of course, I knew the name, but I didn't really know anything about him. And reading that article, I was absolutely captivated and fascinated. And I was very entrepreneurial too, even at that young
Mhm.
age. And so that's really what triggered this lifelong fascination. And it has been sort of my area of specialized interest. And ironically, I've never worked for Disney, but certainly come to know probably more than the vast majority of employees about how Walt started and grew the company, and the trials and tribulations along the way, and what's really led them to where they are today. So yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey. As you mentioned, park visits, they're in the hundreds now, every Disney park around the world. And the book was quite a journey of about 3 or 4 years to research and write. And it's quite a unique book because there are many, many books out there about Disney, but this is really one that is was specifically designed from the ground up. It didn't exist in any other form, which is why I decided to write it, which was how do you apply, how do you take and apply the lessons from Disney in all aspects of their business? I call it marketing, but as you know, how I define marketing is everything you do that affects someone's view of your business. So it's very, very broad definition. So it's not only about making more money. It's about every aspect of running the business and having a good having guests and customers viewing you in a very positive way. So I took all of those lessons and I showed practically how a small business owner can apply them in their own business by adapting the underlying principle. And so that's why it's quite a unique approach to this topic. As I say, there are many, many books out there about Walt's life and the business from different aspects, but most of them have a corporate kind of angle. But I wanted to, create something quite different and make it practical too.
Yes, well, you've achieved that with this audience and making it consumable, relatable, and actionable. So no two ways about it, hands down. This is the best read I've had about the Disney approach. So because there is a lot of content here, what I thought we would do is really boil this down. If I had to have three takeaways that I want to just really mine your expertise on, it's going to be around marketing, in the broadest sense, but also in some of the narrower sense of things we have control over, guest experience, and then it's the little details. And if we just pull those three things out, we're going to realize these are things we have control over without breaking the bank. We're not talking creating a new budget in order to implement these things. These are things that we can do today. So you gave us a definition of marketing, but I want you to slow down and come back to that again. And we're going to park there for a minute because we're going to look at the different lenses through which one might consider marketing. So go for it again. Say that again.
Yeah, it's, you know, if you look at the let's say official marketing association's definition, it's really kind of boring and you know, what I call corporate speak. In other words, it's not a you know, common language definition that everyone can understand, and that's that frustrates me. So I really looked into marketing to sort of come up with a more appropriate definition. And what I came up with is that really marketing is anything that, with the emphasis on anything, anything that you or any of your employees do, which is either good or bad, that affects other people's view of your business. Those other people could be prospects, they could be customers, but it's anything you do that affects their view of the business. That's marketing. And just a simple example of that, and I think I may say this in the book, is I ordered a box of gluten and dairy-free cookies because I can't eat gluten or dairy. So it's kind of a specialized thing. I was really looking forward to trying them. And when I opened the box arrived, when I opened the box, I was hit with the smell of cigarette smoke, which is, you know, I've got nothing personally against someone who smokes. That's their choice, but I'm not a smoker. And for someone who isn't a smoker and with a food product to be hit with that smell of smoke opening the box, I mean, it was unbelievable. So that immediately was very off-putting. But then even more than that, the cookies were not, they were just basically thrown in the box. And so as a result, they'd been rattling around and they were basically crumbs. So
Crumbs.
not only did I have this smell of smoke, I opened them, I was so disappointed. And so even before I'd had the opportunity to try a crumb, which I wasn't particularly interested in at that point anyway, my viewpoint of that business was really, you know, I would have no desire whatsoever to ever order one of their products again, to ever recommend them to someone else. And in fact, you know, I've done the opposite. So that's marketing. That what that business did, what they allowed employees to do, was marketing in a very negative sense in that example. So, you know, another quick example is if you call an office, let's say a dentist office, and the person answers, the receptionist answers the phone, and all you hear is "hold, please." Well, do you feel like a valued? Excuse me.
Yeah, that sense of, okay, hold please. I've got
Yeah.
something more important than you.
Right.
What you say before hold please. So continue your thought.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. Yeah. You know, hold please. Well, you certainly don't feel valued at that point because like you haven't even had a chance to, there was no greeting. You haven't had a chance to say anything.
Yes.
And you know, maybe it's an emergency, for example. So you immediately form an opinion about that company, and then perhaps when you go in for a first visit, all they do is hand you a whole stack of forms, and you're having to fill in your name and address on every page. You know, how irritating is that? Why do they need it on every page? So things like this, you know, it's just that the average business does not think through these things, and we'll get on to attention to details later, but this is an example. And so the point is, in, you know, as we're talking about this, is that everything you do as a business that affects people's view of your business, it's marketing. That's what marketing is.
Yes. In fact, you just gave me an idea as a takeaway for our audience. Every job description should have marketing in it,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
because we are a representation inside and outside of the school, for the brand, for the impressions, all those subtle things that you're talking about. And I want to think about this also in terms of Disney. Imagine if Cinderella is sitting there with her arms folded, leaning back or propped up on, a railing or whatnot. Talk about that. I'm sure that that's
Yeah.
part of what the Disney way is and what they train. I know this is obvious, but I think it's worth highlighting those subtleties of what you take away from body language even.
It is obvious, and it should be um it should be a no-brainer, but the reality is, as we all know, when it comes to practical implementation, we see these kinds of things all the time. I was in visiting a restaurant um a couple of weeks ago in the States. I forget where it was, but anyway, walking up to the restaurant, there's a gaggle of 3 or 4 employees out of the side door. And I forget what they were saying, but it was basically, very negative talk about the business, the working conditions. And so I heard everything, and they're also out there smoking. Again, it's not about, the I'm not anti-smoking. It's just personally, I don't smoke. And you don't want to see that when you're walking up for a meal in a restaurant.
Right.
And so, there's in that situation, it was a well-known brand, but they clearly hadn't had sufficient training and sufficient monitoring of that training to implement something that which should just be so obvious. If those employees, if it's done right, if the onboarding, if the coaching, if the training is done right, they they should be conscious of those things all the time. But again, as we see, we all see these examples every day of employees that are just not, then it's not on their radar. And
Mhm.
so this is why it does need to give attention to. And this was something that Walt was very passionate. In fact, he specifically trained, to your point, he specifically trained every cast member to believe that their primary role was to be a marketer. So it's interesting that you highlighted that, because that's exactly how he trained them. And we can come back to that a little bit later if you like, or we can talk about it now actually if you like.
Well, let's
The
talk about it now. It's
Yeah.
it's relevant because we're going to start tying these the marketing and employee pieces together, because you hear, I'll just kind of anecdotally tuck in here while you continue your thought. We hear, oh, it's so hard to get staff, which it is.
Mm,
And sometimes we tolerate things we ordinarily wouldn't because we're afraid of losing the employee.
right.
It's kind of looking through the telescope from the wrong end. It's if everybody is trained to be a marketer, and there's even a quote that in the book was, we hire for attitude, not aptitude. We can teach someone to drive a bus. We can't teach them to smile and be happy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's such a great quote. That was Walt, who was just so insightful on so many levels, to the genius level. People think of him as sort of this visionary, which he certainly was, but on the practical side of running a business, in terms of understanding psychology, he was absolutely a master. And so that quote really gives an insight into his way of thinking. We hire for attitude, not aptitude. In other words, we don't hire for skill, because if you have the right person with the right attitude towards the business, you can train them to do anything.
Mhm.
And they Walt very much found that to be the case. And over the years, that's proven to be true in every type of business. There's an excellent book that every business owner should read called Good to Great by Jim
Mm.
Collins, where he analyzed all the top businesses in the States over many decades to find what were the commonalities among those successful businesses. And one of the things he found was that you need to fundamentally get the right people on the bus, as he put it. In other words, the choice of person who you hire is in terms of the right mental attitude is far more important than any skill set that they may have, because you might have the most skilled person in the world, but
Yeah.
if they don't align with your company's values, there's going to be constant headbutting, there's going to be constant frustration, they're going to be a renegade, and that's no good to anybody. It doesn't matter how skilled they are. And Walt certainly knew that. And so to this day, very interestingly, the way that Disney goes about hiring is that the first thing that happens when someone goes for an interview to be for any position, literally any position at Disney, is they're ushered into a little theater and they watch a 10 or 15-minute video which explains what Disney's standards and expectations are of an employee or cast member, as they put it. And the whole video is basically designed to put someone off working for Disney by talking about, your physical appearance needs to be absolutely top notch. You need to have a great work ethic. You need to be punctual, and all of these details that Disney expects, which are part of why they have become such a respected brand. What happens is every showing, imagine 100 people in the audience. At the end of every showing, there's about 20 people who walk out and never come back. Well, that's great.
That's
That's
self-selecting.
absolutely that's so good. It's so genius because first of all, those people never even had to speak to anyone, right? They didn't have to Disney didn't have to tie up anybody's time. And secondly, it enabled the person who wasn't the right fit to discover that very, very quickly. No hard feelings, right? It's not, okay, I realize this is a bad choice. It's not for me. And off they go. But the point is, when also from the other perspective, when you do it and then you get the people that go, oh yeah, I'm fine, absolutely fine. I love the fact that you have these standards and values and so on. Count me in. Well, now you've assured that you have got the right person involved. And so this is why, again, to your point earlier, if you're finding that you've got these frustrations with various employees that not doing this and that and the other, it really does trace back to the initial hiring process. That's what needs to be improved in that particular case, because you haven't done enough due diligence and enough kind of work behind the scenes to make sure that the person does align with what you stand for, in terms of your values.
And you hear the term kicking the can down the road, which is, wouldn't you rather know that at the onset? And
Oh,
there's all sorts of uh,
absolutely.
evidence around what the cost is to replace an employee after
That's
you've
right.
in them. You made me think of something, and I wish I had written down the definition. I think it applies here. You mention in the book something called SEP.
Yeah.
What
Someone
is that? I feel like it's
someone
really
else's problem.
here. Say it
Some,
again.
someone else's problem.
Someone else's problem. So tell us about that and how that relates here.
Well, we've all had, we can all relate to the situation where we go into a store and we ask a question and the person says, oh, I don't know. It happened to me a few months ago. I was in England visiting my family. I arrived on a late flight and I'm not really into fast food, but there was nothing else available. So we'd go up to McDonald's. And I said to the guy, young lad working, I said, do you have gluten-free buns available? Because again, I can't have the gluten. And he said, I don't know. And there was just a really awkward pause that eventually I had to say something. And what I said was, well, could you find out? And he said, you could see the cogs whirring, and he said, well, I'm not sure how to do that. So I said, well, do you have a manager? Do you have a manager here? Yes. Could you ask her? So he then turns around and shouts,
Oh, my word.
Lisa, do we have gluten-free buns? And so, just I'm thinking this is just the perfect case study of what not to do. So then Lisa trundles over and I say to her, I was just wondering if you have gluten-free buns. And her response was, I don't know. So I'm thinking this is absolutely surreal. So again, another long pause. We're just looking at each other. And I said, well, could you find out? So she's thinking and said, well, we do have a book with, you know, listing various products. And I said, well, would you mind having a look at it? So she goes and gets the book and she's looking through the pages and she can't find anything. So she goes, she's all getting flustered. I don't know. I don't know. So then she turns around and shouts, Kevin, in the kitchen. Kevin, do we have gluten-free bun? And there's anyway, you get the point.
I do.
Absolutely so frustrating. And we all can relate to that. That it's extremely annoying to any customer to hear the words, I don't know. And
Mhm.
Walt, in his genius, one of the many, many things that he realized was because he understood psychology so well, he knew this. And so what he did, so elegant solution, so clever, any business could do this. He created a little card, like a little like a sheet of paper like this, which folds into four like this, a little bit smaller.
Mhm.
And on that piece of paper in small text is basically the answer to every common question that they know guests ask. And so particularly for
Brilliant.
new cast members, when they don't know these things, they keep it in their pocket. A guest comes up, oh, could you tell me, what time the parade is? They get out the paper. Sure. Bear with me one sec. That's it's going to reach this area about 3 o'clock. Okay. Have a great day. Enjoy the parade. Now, if perchance the answer to the question isn't on this little piece of little card, at the bottom, there's a phone number for the cast member to call. And at the other end of the phone is the guru who knows the answer to all these questions. So what they do is, guest comes up, could you tell me such and such? Let me give me a moment and I'll find out for you. So they call the number and hi, this is Andrew, cast member. I have a guest here, and they were just wondering such and such. And
Yep.
would you mind sharing that with us? Oh, great. Thanks very much. I'll be happy to convey that information. Right. And so there's never, ever a situation where any cast member can say, I don't know, because they've been given the equipment, the tools to be able to deal with the situation. Isn't that brilliant?
It is brilliant. And the reality is, I think about this as a mom and even myself when I'm asked a question, I don't like having to say I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit of pride, but also it's if I'm in a role where they're asking me the question, chances are I should know the answer or have a way to get the answer. So I think that that's brilliant when we think about our schools and when you're going on tours or they're just talking points that should be
Yeah.
quick and easy to be able to answer. And if you don't know, then say, I'm going to get that answer for you.
That's
I
it.
will find you. Like if it's something that they can't
Exactly.
right in
Exactly.
that moment.
It's perfectly okay to not know. It's how you convey that and how you to say, I don't know. And then that's the sort of it's a conversation, finisher.
Yes.
That's so frustrating for customers and guests. But if you say, you know what? Let me find out for you. And
Yes.
it's perfectly fine then to, if you need to in your industry, go away and make some inquiries and so on. In fact, I was on a tour once with some Disney cast members and I asked a few kind of deep questions and that that's exactly what they said. And it was kind of a cute moment because I asked things that they didn't know, but every time they said, you know what, that's a great question. Let me find out for you. And then a few hours later, they had the answer. You know, you're asking about that question. And it was just a beautiful thing because I felt like they were interested in helping me. And that's really what we have to understand is when you say, I don't know, not only is it so frustrating, but it just conveys, you know what, you're not important to me. You're not important enough for me to spend the time to find out. So it's something that every business should train their employees. Never ever say, I don't know.
Yes, there's so many other ways to handle that. Perfect takeaway and segue to guest experiences. So we're beginning to touch upon what the relationship is. We've talked about marketing, anything you do or your employees do that reflect on your brand, that's marketing. We all should have marketing on our resumes, name tags, whatever, but we are all responsible for that. And now guest experience. We obviously think of Disney as there's a guest experience, but you really get into this and there's this, I want to park on the perfection and plussing. What does Disney do? First of all, describe what that is, and then describe what Disney does that we in early education, in all likelihood, can learn and apply without adding a line item to our budget.
Mm. So plussing was a word that Walt actually coined, and excuse me, it was his way of describing the process of continual improvement. He was a perfectionist. He knew it, and he felt that in most cases it was a way that enabled them to be better than anyone else. And so he was never content with the status quo. A classic example of that was in where he started, which was in the movies. If he had he obviously had to have the balance, but given free reign, as it were, he would have spent far more time tweaking the animations in the movies to make them, literally as perfect as possible. He would say that every Disney movie that he watched in the cinema, he would cringe through because he was constantly seeing, oh, we could have done that, we could have done that, we could have done that, we could have done that. And that was one of the things that appealed to him in creating the theme park of Disneyland, because even on the opening day, he said in his opening remarks, Disneyland will never be finished. And he loved that aspect, the fact that he could constantly make improvements, in his words, constantly be plussing. And so he did that in every aspect of the business. There was never a time when he said, you know what, we're mission accomplished, this is the best it can be. Never. He constantly challenged employees and cast members to find little ways to tweak things and to continually improve. And again, it's all of these things. There's nothing new under the sun, as the expression goes. But it's the fact is, most businesses do very quickly get to a point where they think, well, we've got some systems here, and things seem to be running fairly smoothly. Mission accomplished.
Right.
And if you really want to excel, if you really want to grow your business, if you really want to stand out from the crowd and dominate competition, it is these areas, these principles that we're talking about. This is what makes the difference. And, as on this particular topic of plussing, of not being content with the status quo, it is one of those areas that can definitely make a difference. And so Walt, one of the things he loved to do was walk the park every morning, especially in his later years. He actually had an apartment over the fire station at Disneyland, and every morning he would walk the park and look at how can we be plussing anything and everything? And one of my favorite stories, I've got so many, but one of them is one morning, a gardener came up to Walt. He was in front of the Cinderella castle there. And the gardener said, Walt, we have a problem. So Walt said, well, I think you probably mean challenge. Because
Yes.
challenges can be overcome, right? So he said, they laughed, and the gardener said, look at this. The guests are trampling over the flower beds to go over here to take photos of the castle. We need to put up a fence to stop them doing that. And this is such an insight into the way Walt thought, because without a moment's hesitation,
Yep.
Walt said, oh no. He said, the guests are absolutely right. That is a great place to take photos. What we need is a path.
I love that.
That is just so clever, because it perfectly sums up how most business owners and by extension employees view their business. They have the blinders on. And so what they're thinking is, how do we how do we excuse me, how do we implement things that either will make our life easier or just essentially the decision is based on what would be best for us.
Yes.
Walt was always thinking, what is best for the guest? Now, the gardener was not wrong. The gardener was the fact that he cared so much about these beautiful flower beds was a great thing. But he failed to see the much bigger picture, which was, what's the purpose of those flower beds? It's for the guests to enjoy. And if the guests but want to enjoy taking a photo of the castle, why not facilitate that for them? Why not make it easier and still preserve the beauty of the flower beds? So Walt got that in a split second. He didn't even need to
Problem
think about
solved.
it.
Yeah.
It's just so, that's why I love that story, because it's
You too.
it does perfectly illustrate this aspect of not having the blinders on,
Hmm.
always at things from the guest's perspective, and always trying to think, how can we improve things? How can we plus the experience to make it even better?
So we're also going to add to our job descriptions, guest experience specialist or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But I really want to illustrate here for our listeners that we as an industry in early education talk about quality. A vast majority of our websites talk about quality. But if we start training and thinking about we're plussing, we're not asking for you to be a perfectionist, which sounds more punitive, but always be looking for a way to plus. And plus is not always adding to, but maybe taking what you have and doing it differently, which leads to
Absolutely.
a quality experience with the customer, in this case, the parent or the child or the staff member in mind. I absolutely love that. And I think that is a key takeaway and something that's very doable. And now it's going to be a new verb of plussing. We're going to plus. We're going to be looking at plussing opportunities.
Very good.
You're leading me into another area. We could spend way more time on guest experience, but I think this is going to go hand in hand if we start talking about attention to details. And I want you to set this up because you also share a Chinese proverb, but I think we in early education in particular, we're very busy, as is a theme park. When you're very busy, we tend to be task focused, and we tend to be what's my next thing that I need to do? And we're regulated. So, I mean, we tend to move from thing to thing, but let's park there for a minute. Attention to detail. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, again, this came from Walt, as all these things did fundamentally. And again, it's something that um, is we're aware of it. Of course, it's, there's nothing new under the sun. It's an easy phrase to utter, but there is way more to it once you start to sort of get into it. So, attention to details, as it says, is really paying attention to the things that most people don't pay attention to. And as you said, there's a great Chinese proverb which says that there's no scenery in familiarity. And the way that I illustrate that there's no scenery in familiarity is that if you drive to work the same route every day, um, you really don't consciously think about anything that's around you. But there is very interesting scenery there, no doubt. And if you now take the perspective of someone who's just new to the town, they are going to notice so many details of this, that, and the other, as you're driving along, so many things, and they might talk about it, they might express it. But the difference there is when we become accustomed, when we become used to it, when we become familiar with something, when it's commonplace in our business, that's when the scenery fails to be seen.
Yes.
So does that make sense?
It does. It
Yeah.
does. And in your book, you talk about something as simple as when you enter the lobby of a building. There,
Yeah, I had this experience. I forget what I said in the book, but recently, again, I went to a fast food restaurant in the States that's very, very popular. It's a high-end fast food place called Shake Shack, which you may have heard of.
yeah.
And walking up to the server, the first and really only thing that I noticed was that in front of where the cash register was, it was dirty. It was there was thick grease, grime, thick layer of dust. And as I'm placing my order, that's the only thing that I could see. And this is such a great example because why does that happen? Well, it's very simple. The employees never stand where the guests stand. It's really that simple. So attention to detail in that example means having a checklist that includes stand where the guest stands to place their order, look at what the guest sees, and make sure everything is clean and tidy. Because apart from the grease and the grime, which was very off-putting, there was all this like rat's nest of cables for different, equipment and so on, and it just looked terrible. And this is a high-end fast food restaurant, so again, very easy to fix, but you've got to have attention to details in mind in order to do that. And again, Walt he set the example in this. He was so good at it. Again, another story that I just love is Disneyland, shortly after Disneyland opened in 1959, Walt went outside to the parking lot. So why did he do that? Think about it. He's running a theme park business. Shouldn't he be given attention to the rides, the attractions, the shows, the merchandise, the food? Well, yes, but Walt was a genius. So why did he go out to the parking lot? Well, he went out because he realized that's where people would form their first impression of coming to Disneyland, because the parking lot is the first thing they see. Well, when he walked out there, he was absolutely horrified because he had outsourced the parking to a private company, and he found that they were acting like cops or security guards, and they were shouting orders at the guests. They were saying, "Go over there, park. No, don't you hear me? Over there. you know, like, what's wrong with you? Like, you know, this kind of thing. And he was like, oh no. So he very quickly got rid of them. And he said, when he talked about this, he said, I quickly um, changed the process and hired and trained my own people to run the parking. And he said, what I told them was their primary role was to be marketers
Uh-huh.
and to help and welcome guests. Parking efficiency was, yes, it was important, but not as important as helping and welcoming guests.
Mm.
And after he implemented that, everything changed.
Sure.
So the guests drive in. Good morning. Welcome to Disneyland. Are you excited for your day? Yeah. Oh, great. Well, you're gonna love it. Now you see Sarah over there waving with the little Mickey hand. Drive over there. She's gonna find a great place for you to park. Have a lovely day. See the difference?
I totally see the difference.
Night and day. But that only happens when you give attention to the details. See,
Yes.
well, that situation could have existed for a decade, and
Mhm.
things like that do for most businesses. These little things where maybe they outsource or they don't train or whatever the situation is, and they're oblivious to it
Right.
even happening. But
Right.
what realized details matter, and that's why he went out to the parking lot.
So what I'm going to take from this also is a couple of things. Our industry is very checklist centric when it comes to opening and closing and inspecting. But I've never heard somebody say, let's look at it from the guest experience, or in this case, a parent. But now let's get down on the child's
Exactly.
experience on their level, because we are very checklist centric, and I can see where that would be something that would be overlooked, just
Oh,
like
absolutely. Yeah. In
we see
fact,
it every day.
I talked about this with our mutual friend Nick Williams. This very thing, the fact that they should look at things from the parents and the child's perspective. And again, think about it from also your own experiences of when you go into an office or the similar type of environment. Because for me, I noticed the scuff marks on the wall. I noticed the dirt on the carpet. I noticed, the little untidy things and so on. Well, as a business owner, we should notice those things. But again, there's no scenery in familiarity. We don't notice it unless we pre design a checklist to
Yes.
notice it. That's
Yeah.
really the key takeaway is it has to be incorporated in our set of daily procedures
Yes.
in order to implement it.
Absolutely. And you also spurred another thought for me as you were saying that from the guest perspective is, what if you had some sort of make up a role? Again, it's not going to cost you anything, but they're guest ambassadors. They're
Mm.
ambassadors. It's a rotating responsibility where they take that checklist thing and they look at it from the child and the parent's perspective. And you have a different person who's an ambassador, a guest experience ambassador. I mean, I'm making up names as we go here.
No, it's great. It's great. Yeah.
Just a new set of eyes to look at something. Like you say, we drive the same path every day. We don't notice the scenery familiar because it is familiar. Here's a way to look through fresh eyes, even from your own staff members who might not look in certain parts other than in their classroom or that path to their classroom. So I think
Yeah.
that could actually be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Make it fun and the key, as we said, is to incorporate it in the regular processes that you have.
Yes. I know we're coming up at the end of our time. Could I get maybe another 5 or 7?
Sure, yeah. No worries at all. Keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So something that also is top of mind in the work that I do at the Compliance Alliance is not only the checklist, which you've given me some great ideas to take away, and your standard operating procedures. We're all marketeers. The attention to the detail, the guest experience. I mean, these are all fabulous, fabulous takeaways. I would love to get your input and your feedback on what you might have learned from Walt when it comes to safety. And let me set this up for a moment. In early education, when I look at the vast majority of the websites, we sort of touch upon safety, but we often talk about our curriculum, our ratios, our yes, our quality standards. I could go into a whole nother chapter that you have about jargon and language, your language. So I know you want to say something about that. We tend to use our own language about what that means, but parents and children don't necessarily understand QRIS or licensing standards and ratios and all that other good stuff.
Right, right.
But if you could give us your insights to safety, Disney, in my research, they have 5 keys, 5 pillars, and the very, very, very first one is safety.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about safety, sometimes that's a scary thing because safety either means you're safe or you're not safe. But could you help us think about that any differently based on what you saw Walt do or what you see in how employees are trained or what they do to really give a sense of safety and say safety, but imply safety in the way they do things?
Yeah, absolutely. It is certainly no coincidence that it is number one, and that's very much involved in the training too. That every cast member it's really honed into them that that safety is the number one priority. It comes above all else, and for good reason, because as Walt realized very early on, when you look at a very popular park like Disneyland, on any given day, it's really a small city, um, with many, many thousands of people visiting, or, a town or a city. And um, if you look at today's numbers, for example, on any given day, there's about just shy of 160,000 people visiting the Walt Disney World parks. On average, it's more and it's less depending on the day, but on average, well, that is the size of a small city. And so if you were to take the view of, well, the likelihood of something bad happening with this particular attraction, it's 1 in a million, well, that when you say that, it sounds, well, that's really, okay, great, 1 in a million, like that's nothing, is it? That's is the likelihood is so small. Well, actually, 1 in a million for Disney means 1 every 6 days, because every 6 days there's about 1 million guests. So 1 in a million means 1 every 6 days. Well, that completely paints a very, very different picture, doesn't it? And so that's why they realized very early on that safety standards have to be far, far more stringent than other organizations or places. So when Disney looks at compliance, for example, they don't comply. They go way beyond compliance. They have their own internal standards. So, and again, that's very significant if you think about it, because standards are in place for a reason, aren't they? Compliance standards. They're to avoid negative situations, and it's a good thing. But is our attitude as a business owner, oh, I guess we have to comply, I guess we have to meet those standards? Well, that is one way of looking at it, but surely a far better way of looking at it is, why are those standards in place? Well, to avoid a bad situation. What could that do to our business? It would be a very negative result. It could destroy the business. Well, when you really think about the implications of why those standards exist, they're not there for an annoyance. They're not there to be difficult. They are there for good reason. And so that's why Disney says, well, let's not stop with the standards that have been imposed on us. Let's look at other ways that we can go beyond that. And that's exactly what they do with every aspect of the business. I think that that's very insightful for them. And I think a great example is their recent, in the last few years, they installed something that they call the Skyliner, which is a cable car or gondola system. And it connects two of the parks at Disney World with a number of the hotels. So, excuse me, why did they, excuse me, why did they install that? Well, very, very, very interesting. They, in research, they found out, because Disney, of course, with the sheer numbers that they have, time and unforeseen occurrence does affect people, and there are fatalities within the Disney road system, and regularly, but just through the sheer numbers. That's something that they can't control. But they looked at that and they said, well, how could we improve that? And of course, at first glance, it seems, well, you can't control the way people drive. But then, as Disney always said, don't think outside the box. Don't, he said, imagine that the box doesn't even exist.
Yes.
And so that's what they did. And they said, well, let's, this is not necessarily about driving. It's about fundamentally moving guests around, right? Getting guests from A to B. If many guests are driving from their hotel to the parks, how can we change that? So one of the things they introduced was buses, which helped, but still a lot of people drive. So when they looked at this cable car system from, I think, an Austrian manufacturer, the safety record compared to driving was absolutely night and day difference. It was extraordinary, the numbers of how safe it is compared to having accidents. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because it's a fixed system and so on. But so that's why Disney did that. As a side thing, it's a very fun experience, which is great. But that wasn't the reason they did it. They did it to improve safety, because they're always looking to make improvements. And again, even with implementing that system, they went above and beyond what people normally do in installing these types of systems. As an example, in every cabin of those gondolas, there's an emergency kit. Well, no one else does that, but Disney thought, well, if guests do get stuck for any reason, what can we do? So they give them a glow stick, bottles of water, a notebook, and even emergency waste bags. So, but that's the Disney difference, you see, is no one else would have thought about doing that. No one else would have even thought about, there's no theme park in the world that would have looked at how can we reduce the number of deaths within our own internal road system. No other organization would have done that. Very few organizations, let alone a theme park. That is the difference with Disney, because safety is their number one priority. And that's a great example of how it is played out.
Yeah. And I think too, relating it over to early education, we're not necessarily moving vehicles and people in that way, but I think we can bring it down to our own environment where we're moving children.
Yeah, it's the principle. It's the underlying principle.
And what I would really love to see us do as an industry is where safety is a badge of honor, not of fear, but being more foot forward about it. When I'm a parent and, my children are older now, but I remember in dropping off my daughter, and as I drove away, I was not thinking about the curriculum, the ratios, how beautiful the building was. I was thinking about my child being left in the care of somebody else. Is she safe?
Yeah, great example.
And so that's where I think that we as an industry, and I'd like your opinion as a marketeer and somebody who's studied this. I mean, how do you relate to that? I mean, why do we shy away from it? Maybe that's the question I'm asking.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with your evaluation on that, by the way. I think that it does sort of carry a certain amount of baggage with it. You know, I think the um, viewpoint fundamentally is wrong, um, because it's seen as, you know, these standards and so on, they're seen as an imposition. Um, but more than that, it starts with the attitude of the business owner, and realizing how serious these things are, um, that it does matter. And I think, that, you know, again, to the point about jargon and so on, I think the reason it matters, um, as far as trying to get away from jargon, is because jargon just makes things more complicated, unnecessarily complicated. It makes things more mysterious. It takes it away from being commonplace and makes it sort of, every industry likes to create jargon. I don't know why, but um, it it alienates people from implementation rather than making it easier. And it is a fundamental issue in pretty much every industry. So Disney tries to do that. You know, they have everything in plain English, all the trainings in plain English. They definitely shun jargon for good reason. And so I think it's there is a journey involved here in every industry to try and, um, first of all, educate business owners as to changing their own attitude towards this, to see it as something that is important and understand why. And you know, Disney's not perfect themselves. They've made a number of missteps, pretty big ones. And a great example on that I like to share is in Michael Eisner's tenure as CEO. And he did a lot of good things, but he also did a number of very crazy things. One of them was, he um, one of his first big decisions was to create a new ride called Splash Mountain. It was over $100 million, you know, massive, massive budget, big decision. And he was very passionate about it. And because he basically gave it the green light, and it was oversaw it as his first big decision, he wanted to be the one to ride it first with his son. And so he approached the construction coordinator, um, and you know, when he heard that it was basically ready, and the construction coordinator said, well, you know, normally we like to do quite extensive testing. And he said, well, you know, why do you do all that? We said, well, you know, just to make sure. It's sort of, you know, formality, but we like to do that. And it my eyes said, what? You sort of brushed it off. Well, you know, it's safe, isn't it? Well, yeah, of course it's safe. So he basically strong-armed this guy into letting him and his son be the first to ride the ride. And so they did. And they going down this water flume ride, um, they were nearly decapitated because, unbeknown to anyone, someone had forgot to remove a wooden plank that
Oh,
was positioned over the ride, and they managed to duck just in time and avoid it. But it was a very, very terrible, could have been so tragic. easily. And
Yep.
that that was a huge wake-up call for Disney, even though safety had been their number one standard for decades, because it showed in the right circumstance just how easy it is for that standard.
To go down and bad things can happen.
Yeah.
I think that something that we can do as an industry, borrowing from Disney, when I look at their, they have a safety pledge. And it's very simple, and we can modify it for early education, which
Yeah.
is I keep myself safe, I
Yeah.
keep my employees safe, or my children in this case that I'm in charge of, and I keep my environment safe. I'm oversimplifying it, but if you focus on those three things, imagine also that you can market that to your families to say every employee takes the ABC Sunshine House pledge to safety, which is boom, boom, boom. We have said we consider it a priority, we can
Yeah.
market it, and we can also train to what the standard is. And I love the other thing that you said, Walt Disney said, which is don't think outside of the box. Think as if there is no box. And that's a huge takeaway for me is let's, again, it goes back to the looking at things from fresh perspective. So
Yeah.
Andrew, all I can say is, I mean, we barely scratched the surface in
There's
your,
certainly a lot more, yeah.
there's so much more. There's 17 chapters, Walt's Way, Andrew Locke. This has been an enjoyable conversation, as well as just some key takeaways. I know our audience is going to be walking away saying, now I see where what the connection is as a business owner or as an employee or cast member in the case of Disney. How can I apply these practices? And we're not talking about bloating our budgets. We're talking about things that we can do every day to really make a difference. So thank you for your time and your insights, Andrew.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, it's always fun to apply these lessons to help small business owners.
Yes. Now, I had a parting thought too. You would be an amazing speaker for early education conferences. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, sure. I love speaking at live events. If you go to andrewlocke.com, that's LOCK, there's a lot more information there about speaking and lots of articles too, to further the discussion about how to apply these types of lessons to any business. So encourage you to check it out. Yeah, andrewlocke.com.
Excellent. We'll do that. And I hope you fall in love with early education as much as I have. So perhaps we'll get you back in a future episode as we unpack some of these things. But again, thank you for your generosity of time and your insights.
Oh, my pleasure.